In every person's life, an inevitable turning point arrives when the familiar roles between parents and their adult children begin to undergo significant changes. For decades, parents devoted themselves to raising their children, tirelessly guiding them through life, making countless sacrifices for their well-being. However, one day they realize, with a pang of sorrow, that the old order has been disrupted. Perhaps their offspring have started to openly disregard wise advice, dismiss valuable opinions, or, far more painfully, create a sense of being useless or a burden, causing deep emotional hurt. When children begin to show significantly less reverence for their parents than they undoubtedly deserve, it can lead to strong feelings of disappointment or even righteous anger. The natural impulse in such a situation is to remind one's offspring of the countless efforts and selflessness of the years when their needs and well-being were prioritized above all else. However, one undeniable truth must be learned. Expressing anger cannot resolve conflict. On the contrary, it often exacerbates an already tense situation. Instead, there's a far more effective method for restoring lost respect, one that avoids bitter quarrels, exhausting arguments, and deep resentment. This narrative will present 6 key strategies that parents can employ when faced with disrespect from their children. These methods involve powerful yet simple adjustments to one's own reactions, capable of fundamentally changing how parents are perceived by their offspring. Some of the suggested approaches may seem unexpected, but if the reader pays attention to the exposition until the very end, they will discover a path to reclaiming their status as a respected and indispensable figure in the lives of their adult children. Let us proceed to examine these steps. The first and most crucial action: stop desperately seeking their approval. One of the most common and, unfortunately, profound mistakes parents make, especially as they age, is an excessive and sometimes desperate desire to please their adult children. Many may recognize this behavior in themselves. They go to great lengths to accommodate their children's wishes, say yes when they internally wish to say no, and invariably put their offspring's needs above their own, naively hoping that sufficient concessions will earn them greater recognition and value. However, there is a bitter truth. The more actively one seeks their children's approval, the more paradoxically they begin to lose respect. Genuine respect is not earned through self-sacrifice or constant concessions. It is born from self-respect. If parents constantly compromise, give in on everything, and tirelessly try to maintain the illusion of peace at any cost, they are in essence unintentionally teaching their children that their own feelings, desires, and needs are secondary. And once this belief takes root in their offspring's minds, it becomes exceedingly easy for them to take their parents for granted, failing to value their contributions and presence. A vivid example is the story of a woman named Margaret, who in her younger years was remarkably strong-willed and independent. However, with the passage of time, as she aged, she gradually began to allow her adult children to completely dictate terms and make all key decisions. Margaret rearranged her personal schedule to suit their needs, carefully concealed her own opinions even when they differed from theirs, and, most regrettably, ignored the openly dismissive tone with which they sometimes addressed her. "I just want to keep our family together," she once confessed. But what was the outcome? Her children completely stopped valuing her. In their eyes, she became someone who was always willing to accommodate, always agree to any decision, and always remain silent. Margaret sincerely believed that she was maintaining peace in the family this way, but in reality, she was gradually losing her own voice and authority. Thus, if children show disrespect to their parents, the first and most important step is not to demand reverence, but to cease the behavior that creates the impression of needing their approval. Parents must firmly establish personal boundaries, resolutely say no when truly necessary, and openly express their opinions, even if they may not be to their offspring's liking. For the moment a person truly begins to respect themselves, their children inevitably begin to perceive them in a completely different light. And in time, that deserved respect will surely return. Second action: don't argue but model. When children disregard their parents' opinions, rudely interrupt them, or display outright disrespect, the first natural reaction might be to engage in an argument, remind them of all the sacrifices made for them, and demand that they listen carefully. However, one must learn a lesson that will save years of bitter disappointment. Arguments in such situations never yield the desired result. Consider this. When was the last time anyone managed to convince another person to respect them by confronting them? True respect is earned not through words or demands, but through one's own presence, through how one behaves, how one reacts when others try to test their patience. If parents respond to disrespect with outbursts of anger, they merely confirm the ingrained belief in their children's minds that the offspring have power over their parents' emotional state and behavior. Consider the case of Frank, a retired teacher who, throughout his professional life, confidently led numerous classes of students with unwavering assurance. However, within the walls of his own home, his adult children began to treat him as secondary, insignificant. They openly ignored his wise advice, dismissively brushed aside his concerns, and at times even allowed themselves to laugh when he tried to tactfully correct them. Initially, Frank responded by arguing, desperately trying to prove that he still deserved their deference and respect. But the more actively he tried to assert his position in verbal battles, the more tense and estranged their relationship became. Then, one day, Frank drastically changed his tactics. Instead of engaging in endless arguments, he began to truly listen, showing genuine attention to his children's words. He stopped desperately seeking respect through persuasion and arguments, and instead began to behave like a person who already possessed that respect by right. His speech became calm, filled with wisdom, devoid of any need to win every dialogue. And gradually, his children began to notice these changes. They saw before them a person who did not desperately need their approval, who had nothing to prove, a person who simply embodied inner strength and dignity. If your children show disrespect, do not fight with them for it. Instead, show them what true respect is through how you treat yourself. Maintain your dignity in any situation, speak confidently, and, most importantly, never stoop to their level in emotional displays or communication style. For when you stand firm, radiating dignity, they will inevitably feel it, and in time, may follow your example, adopting this behavior pattern. Action 3. Detach emotionally. One of the most challenging but vitally important lessons to learn with age is that you cannot allow yourself to be emotionally dependent on your adult children. Of course, parents can deeply love their offspring and sincerely wish for that love and respect to be reciprocated. However, the moment children sense that their parents need them to feel valued and significant, the balance of power in the relationship irrevocably shifts. The reality is, people, including even one's own children, respect those who maintain emotional independence. When parents rely on their children for approval, affection, or attention, it creates unbearable pressure on the offspring. And instead of feeling gratitude or tenderness, children begin to feel burdened by this responsibility. As a result, they may withdraw, become impatient, or even irritated in their interactions. And the more persistently parents chase their love, the less freely and naturally children are willing to give it. As an illustration, consider the story of Helen, a kind-hearted mother who gave her children literally everything. When her offspring grew up and immersed themselves in their own adult lives, Helen found herself constantly waiting for a phone call, hoping they would reach out. When calls didn't come, she started calling them herself, often too frequently. She constantly reminded them how much she missed them, how she wished they would visit more often. But instead of bringing them closer, such behavior, on the contrary, pushed the children away. They began to perceive her calls as a burdensome obligation, not something they eagerly anticipated. Then, one day, Helen acted differently. She stopped waiting and stopped calling first. Instead, she focused on herself. She began to pursue new hobbies, spend time with friends, actively take care of her own happiness and well-being. And something amazing happened. Her children started calling more often. They began to respect her time, seeing her as a person with a full and rich life of her own. The lesson is simple. The less you depend on your children to feel needed, the more they will begin to value your presence. When you demonstrate to them that you can stand firmly on your own 2 feet, they will begin to respect you not out of a sense of duty or obligation, but because they genuinely admire the life you have built for yourself. Action 4. Set and enforce boundaries. One of the key reasons children lose respect for their parents is that parents themselves often allow it. If you permit your children to speak to you disrespectfully, disregard your opinion, or treat you as if your time and feelings are of no importance, they will continue to do so. And it's not that they are bad people, but rather that people, especially family members, will always treat you the way you allow them to. Setting boundaries does not mean distancing yourself from your children or intentionally creating conflict. It means making a calm but firm decision about what behavior you will accept and what you will not. And even more importantly, it means consistently enforcing these boundaries when they are crossed. I recall a man named Robert, a retired businessman who had managed a large company with iron discipline and unwavering confidence throughout his life. However, when it came to his adult children, he faced significant difficulties. They constantly interrupted him when he spoke, dismissively brushed aside his concerns, and even allowed themselves to criticize his lifestyle. Initially, he tolerated it, convincing himself it wasn't worth an argument. But over time, he realized that every time he remained silent, he was inadvertently teaching them that their behavior was acceptable. So, one day, Robert changed his approach. When his son interrupted him, he calmly but firmly said, "I will continue speaking when you are ready to listen." When his daughter dismissed his opinion, he simply replied, "You don't have to agree with me, but I expect you to respect me." And when they continued to test his patience, he made it clear. If they couldn't treat him with basic respect, he wouldn't spend time with them. And you know what happened? They started listening. At first, they resisted, of course, but over time, they understood that their father would not back down from his principles. They saw that he valued himself enough to demand respect. And because of that, they began to give it to him. If your children are not showing you respect, it's time to ask yourself, are you allowing them to? Because if you don't set clear boundaries, they won't set them for you. And if you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will. Action 5. Stop giving without gratitude. One of the quickest and surest ways to lose the respect of others is to continue giving to those who are unable to appreciate what they receive. And as parents, we, unfortunately, make this mistake far more often than we realize. We selflessly give our time, our energy, our support, even when our efforts go unrecognized, even when they're taken for granted, even when in return we face only a sense of entitlement to our help. However, here is the undeniable truth. When you continue to give to someone who does not value your gifts, you are not building love or respect. You are merely forming an expectation. They stop seeing your kindness as something valuable and begin to perceive it as something they're fully entitled to. And the moment you stop giving, they do not feel gratitude, but only discomfort or inconvenience. I knew a man named George, a father who was always exceptionally generous towards his children. He provided them with financial assistance when they needed it, dropped everything to come to their aid, and even rearranged his own life to meet their needs. But instead of sincere gratitude, he constantly faced complaints and dissatisfaction. They didn't say thank you. On the contrary, they expected even more. And what was worse, when he himself finally needed their help, they were too busy to respond. Then, one day, George changed his behavior. He stopped overextending himself. He stopped offering help before being asked, and, most importantly, began to say no when necessary. At first, his children were disappointed. They didn't understand why he was no longer willing to do everything for them. But over time, something changed. They began to value his time, to value his efforts, because they suddenly realized that his generosity was not limitless. It was a gift, not some guaranteed service. If you feel your children do not respect your time, your efforts, or your kindness, take a step back. Ask yourself, are you giving them more than you should? And if so, What would happen if you stopped? Because when you teach people that your generosity is contingent on respect, they will begin to treat it that way. Action 6. Build a life outside of them. One of the most powerful ways to regain your children's respect is to clearly demonstrate to them that your happiness and well-being do not revolve exclusively around them. As parents, it's natural for us to dedicate ourselves to our children, making them the center of our universe. However, as we age, this relationship dynamic changes. And if you have prioritized them your entire life, they may begin to see you as someone who, in essence, has nothing else but them. People respect those who have their own purpose, their own interests, their own sense of self-fulfillment. And if your children see that you rely on them for entertainment, approval, or meaning in life, they may begin to feel overwhelmed by this responsibility. Or, even worse, they may start to perceive you as someone who doesn't have a full life of their own. I knew a woman named Eleanor, a widow in her 70s. After her husband's death, she completely devoted herself to her children's lives. She constantly checked on them, gave unsolicited advice, expecting them to fill the void her spouse once occupied. But instead of bringing them closer, such behavior, on the contrary, pushed them away. They started visiting her less, their phone calls became shorter, and Eleanor felt lonelier than ever before. Then she made a conscious choice. She joined a book club, started traveling with friends, and volunteered at a local community center. She stopped making her children the center of her world. And something incredible happened. Her children started reaching out more often. They were genuinely curious about what she was doing. They admired her independence. They began to respect her. If your children are not showing you respect, ask yourself, do they see you as a person with a full, meaningful life? Or do they perceive you as someone constantly waiting for their attention? Because when you show them that you are living, not just existing, they will begin to see you in a completely different light. Final thoughts. Respect is not something you can demand from your children. It is something you inspire through your own behavior, how you set and enforce boundaries, and how you live your life. If they have started treating you with less care, attention, or respect, do not waste your energy on anger and resentment. Instead, change your approach. Stop seeking their approval because the less you need it, the more they will be willing to give it. Model behavior because your dignity speaks much louder than any words. Detach emotionally because the more self-sufficient you are, the more they will respect your presence. Set clear boundaries because people will only treat you as you demand. Stop giving without gratitude because when generosity is taken for granted, it inevitably loses its value. And, most importantly, build a life outside of them. Because people respect those who have their own purpose, their own joy, and their own sense of self-fulfillment. If you follow these pieces of advice, something incredible will happen. Your children will begin to see you in a completely different light, not as someone waiting for their attention, but as someone who commands respect simply by being who they are. And in time, that respect will surely return to you. Not because you demanded it, but because you genuinely earned it.